Welcome to our first Zoom Civility session. And this is the Civility Project. I'm Lynn Galadner. I'm really lucky to work with Stephen and Nolan on this. And I thought what we would do is we would first introduce what the Civility Project is, and Stephen and Nolan can introduce themselves as well. And then they'll talk for a bit. And then if you guys have questions, please use the chat at the bottom of the screen. It's a little dialogue bubble. And if you, a white window will open on the right of your screen if you click on that. And if you have a question, just put it in there to everyone. And I'll see it, or you can put it directly to me because you can just private message one person. And I will be the one asking questions of Stephen and Nolan so that all of your questions can get in. But yeah, again, please mute your microphone so that we don't have any feedback going on. And then we will get started. I first would love to introduce Margaret, who is with Delta Dental, who is responsible for very generously supporting the Civility Project and helping us get out there. So Margaret, I would love to turn the mic over to you. Tell a little bit about your sponsorship.
Yeah, we at Delta Dental, okay, good. Okay, good, I'm talking. Good, I'm talking. We couldn't resist when the Civility Project first was introduced. And that was Delta Dental cares what goes in your mouth as much as you want. In our normal times, when we saw a polarization in our communities that was creating really ineffective problem solving. And now that we are in a crisis, we certainly see that civility really gone by the wayside. And whatever we can do to support a more productive, more unified dialogue, in good and bad, we think will create better communities, more healthy communities. Our whole purpose as an organization is to build healthy, smart, vibrant communities. And those are communities where people talk to each other and they get things done. And so wherever we can facilitate that, certainly Nolan and Steve have a platform and a reputation for doing this. So we just want to be part of something positive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your generous sponsorship. Delta Dental is a huge supporter of really meaningful programs. And so Margaret Trimmer, thank you so much for being here and for making this happen. Really appreciate it. So Stephen and Nolan, I'd love for you guys to introduce yourselves and the Civility Project, sort of where did it come from and why are you doing this? And then we will get into some more specific questions.
Okay, you want me to start, Steve?
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, this grew out of our personal friendship, which started many, many years ago, as you might imagine, over our common love of bourbon. And we spent a lot of time drinking bourbon and talking about things, sometimes talking about very contentious things. And of course, we don't come anywhere close to agreeing on most things, but we found we were able to sit down, have a bourbon, have a conversation about very difficult subjects without getting too angry, without shouting too much, but always walking away as friends. And it seemed to surprise others around us that we could do this. And it occurred to us as we do, as you mentioned, Lynn, as we have become more polarized, that this is not common anymore, that we do tend to bunker up in our comfort zones, in our with our people who agree with us. And increasingly, the conversations across the divide are uncivil and hateful. And we thought if we could just talk to people about that and get them talking, this, you know, we could make a difference. And we started out with bourbon nights. We invited a mixed crowd in, people from all different views, and invited them to socialize and get to know each other and, you know, see people as people first, not as their opinions first.
Yeah, you know, the unlikely friendship between Nolan and I think over the years has kind of led us to wonder what it is about that friendship that endures and what allows us to be able to have conversations that, get heated, where we not just disagree, but disagree strongly. And sometimes even with some temper involved, but then to keep coming back to that conversation. And so a couple of years ago, when NPR StoryCorps was in town, I thought it would be a really interesting exercise for Nolan and I to go and spend some time talking about not just why we disagree and what we disagree over, but where our opinions come from. In other words, what is it about what we sort of have experienced in our lives, the things that we've seen or done that leads us to believe the things that we do? Because I think that's always been kind of a key to being able to see past what somebody's opinion is. When you know where someone's from and how they came to be who they are, why they think the way they do, it gets a little harder to demonize them. It gets a little easier to think of them as, a person who may be a lot like you. And so that exercise led us, I think, to think more about some of the principles that allow us to do that, allow us to carry on our relationship despite really bitter differences sometimes. And that led us to the Civility Project, where we wanted to share those principles with lots of different people, with lots of different groups, as a way of saying, actually, you can do this too. This isn't that mystifying. It isn't that hard. There are some things that all of us can employ as ways to, as ways to get past the differences and talk about things in a way that respects everybody who's involved in the conversation. And we'll get into some of those principles, this hour when we're talking what they are and how to use them. But those really are the bedrock, I think, of the relationship that Nolan and I have, but they're also the bedrock of productive civil conversations between any two people who disagree.
And what came out of that StoryCorps session was the realization that everybody comes to their opinions the same way. They look at the facts, they look at the situation, they look at the issue, and then they apply their own values and experiences to it. And that's why we come up with different opinions. And people who come up with a different view than you based on their own values and experiences aren't evil. They're not stupid, which is the most common perceptions people have of folks on the other side. And they're not stupid, they're not evil. They just have different experiences in their lives and different values. And if you can understand what those experiences and values are, if you can spend the time getting to know people before you start arguing with them about politics, it helps sort of smooth the conversation.
Absolutely. So I just want to give everyone a little bit of background. When we started really moving forward with the Civility Project earlier this year, the intention was to book these programs that we do in person. They can be an hour long, they can be longer. And we started filling up the calendar. And then the coronavirus hit. And so, as you can imagine, any big in-person events are on hold for the foreseeable future. And we will get through this, and we'll be back convening together when we can do it safely. But we were talking about what's happening now as we're all sheltering in place, and we're seeing so many things unfold. And I don't know about you, but I check my phone way too often. And so there's all kinds of news from every direction that's coming at me, and it's hard to digest. It's hard to know how to make sense of everything. And as we were chatting, we thought it could be really useful to get people together virtually to talk a little bit about how do we build civility in a time of crisis? Because even with everything going on right now, we're seeing polarization, we're seeing political opposition related to the virus. We're seeing a lot of anger and emotion directed at people out of the discomfort and the uncertainty that we're all feeling. And so we thought if we could get together here, we could perhaps address that and all walk away with some tools to better get along and help each other through this process. So I wonder if Stephen and Nolan, if you guys would like to start with what you're seeing right now about related to the coronavirus and any incivility that you're seeing unfold, maybe experiences you've had, or any insights you have as to why it might be playing out this way.
Well, Lynn, I will tell you, and I don't know what Steve's experience is. We haven't spoken about this, but I have never seen it this bad in terms of the conversation and the vitriol on a personal level. I mean, from the emails I get, I mean, there is this feeling, sense that I get, that people are not interested in hearing anything, any opinions other than the ones they hold, and they get very angry and nasty and bitter. I could read some of these emails and some of the names I've been called over the last couple of weeks whenever I express a contrary opinion different than other people have. And then the cross conversation, but the comments between the different groups, the people who feel somewhat differently. And it's been just a shocking difference for me, because usually you think in times like this, we start to build community and some kindness toward each other. It has been extraordinarily bitter in the correspondence I receive. And I think that's unfortunate because we don't know the answer to this. I don't know the answer to this. I think it's important to get all sorts of different viewpoints and opinions out there and debate them and consider them, and not lock in on one view and then attack and criticize and try to shout down all other views. Particularly in a time like this, we need to have open conversations, and we need to be considering everybody's ideas.
So it's interesting to hear Nolan talk about that, and you know, we work in really different spaces now, Nolan and I do, and I think our interactions with people are sometimes shaped more by those contexts than they are even by our personalities. But my main platform for interacting with people now is the radio show that I host on public radio here in Detroit each morning. Where we have been, of course, talking about coronavirus every day, usually from a different angle. We've had, you know, public officials on, doctors, community leaders, community activists, you know, everybody trying to get people information primarily about what's going on, what resources they can access, how they can connect to things that they need at this time. And I have to say that the tone that we've tried to set there is quite deliberately about connection. I begin each show with the phrase "good day." I usually say hello or hey to people when the show starts, but I've been starting with "good day," and I've been doing that because I say that each day that we're able to have this forum, each day that we're able to come together there and talk about these things is indeed a good day, because for lots of people, that's not possible. And the response to that has been a much more civil conversation than I have ever had. The outpouring of emotion that people have expressed on the air during the show, but also in emails to me and the other staff of the show, has been really remarkable. And no, it's not always, I mean, we're not always talking about something that's non-controversial. I mean, who can be for the pandemic, right? Sometimes we're talking about differences and differences of opinion, but I have found people to be in a mood where they want to connect more, because we can't do it in the physical world, but B, where they just want to get information and feel as though they're being heard. and so that's led to this very, very different space, I think. I used to write a column and be an editorial page editor. And I would imagine that, based on the feedback I always got in those jobs, it would look like that, what Nolan is experiencing if I were still in those roles.
Yeah.
I think that space is a little bit different. And Nolan, let's be honest. I mean, you have been expressing opinions that are not popular. I mean,
I feel that's important. I mean,
it is.
Because, I don't think this is a time when we can lockstep. I think we need to explore everything. And, I really do think that there are opinions that may be minority opinions right now, as we've always seen. Minority opinions can very quickly become majority opinions as things change. And we're in an environment where things are changing. We publish op-eds in the paper from every viewpoint. And we've got there's a good number of folks who say, oh, you shouldn't print that. You shouldn't print those things. Well, I don't think we should be shutting down any conversations, any ideas. At this point, we should be thoughtfully considering everything.
Yeah. And I think it's harder for people to do that right now, in part because of what's at stake. There has never been more at stake in my lifetime for everyone. I can't think of anything that quite compares to what we've experienced in the last week, let alone what we might be anticipating in the next week or the week after that. And people are hurting. People are hurting in profound ways. I'm now up to 3 people who I know who've lost their lives to this. And I can't compare this to anything else that's happened. And so I really do understand the level of grief that people have, and that in that grief, it's even harder to be civil with someone you disagree with. And it's really hard to be civil with someone who you think is expressing an opinion that might seem to support the idea that maybe this isn't as bad as it is what you're experiencing, or that or that we ought not take it as seriously.
Well, and I don't think, I have seen very few people do that, Steve, but I have heard from a lot of people, and we printed a lot of opinions, and I've written about a lot of opinions from people who say the approach we're taking, and have very solid reasons for saying this, they're not pulling it out of thin air. The approach we're taking might not be the right approach. And I think that's a fair question to ask, because we've never been through this before. Yeah. And so if you have somebody saying, well, maybe that approach isn't the right approach, I think we need to consider and test and explore that before we get too far down the road of one approach that we find out later doesn't work. But Lynn, do we have questions coming in?
We do, and thanks for doing that. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for putting your questions in the chat. And if you have additional ones, please put them there and we will get to them. Margaret was saying that we seem to be in a national state of grief, as you mentioned, Stephen, and anger is part of the grief process. So she's wondering, is some of the anger and hostility toward one another a natural byproduct of this grief? What do you guys think about that?
So I think anger is different from incivility, right?
Yes.
Nolan and I get angry at each other about stuff that we disagree with. If you watch the television show we are on together, you see that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think a big part of what we're talking about when we talk about civility is this idea that you should try to confront things that make people reach that level of anger sometimes, right? Sometimes you have disagreements that lead you to that emotion. It's about how you express that anger, I think, is what we're talking about, right? Is there a civil way to express?
Do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you define what you mean when you guys say civility? Maybe that would help the conversation too.
Well, I mean, I can start with that. I think it's approaching a conversation, approaching a relationship from the standpoint that you're willing to listen as well as lecture. And I think what we've seen too much over the last few years in our society is everybody wants to lecture, everybody wants to preach, nobody really wants to listen much, or few people want to listen much. And this idea of approaching a conversation with somebody you disagree with the idea that I want to hear what that person has to say because I might learn something. And from the very beginning of taking this job as editorial page editor 20 years ago, May 1st, it'll be, I approached it with the idea I may be wrong. And I want to be tested. I want to be challenged. I want to be forced to consider my position because I'm always thinking I may be wrong. And Steve, of course, reminds me that I am. But talking with Steve, and having Steve to interact with like this forces me to sharpen my views and test my views and make sure I don't get too smug about the things I believe and the things I feel.
I mentioned earlier that there's a couple of principles that I think attend the idea of civility and this idea of, this project that Nolan and I are working on together. And one of them, as Nolan pointed out, is that idea of listening. And when we say listen, we're talking about a very specific exercise. We're not talking about not talking, right? Listening is actually trying to give the other person that you're in the conversation with a chance to explain and support the position they have. And while they're doing that, listening means that you are thinking about what they're saying. You are trying to process it. You are not necessarily sitting there thinking, well, here's what I'm going to say back, which I think is what a lot of people do when they seem to be listening. They're actually thinking about what they're going to say. They're not thinking about what the person who's talking is saying. Another one of those principles is that unwillingness to give up, right? Yeah. Nolan and I never walk away from a conversation and say, well, that's it. I am done with that guy. I'm not talking to him anymore. I'm not arguing with him anymore. I'm finished. You might be mad. You might be frustrated, but you come back and you continue that conversation. I think that is a huge, huge part of civility. And again, that's different from not being angry or not being frustrated. And then the third principle, I think, is being able to say that I know this person, I know what they think, but I don't define them by that opinion. I don't reduce them to just that. That is a part of who they are. It may be a part of who they are that I don't like and decide that I can't stand even. But I know that that's not the whole of their person. And so I can be friends with that person because I'm able to say, I don't like this part of who they are. I don't like what they say. I don't like what they believe, but I know more than that about them. And I know they are more than that.
And I would add two things to that. I would add that you don't approach it with the idea that you're going to convert someone. If your mission is to convert, don't bother having the conversation. I am never going to convince Steve that he's wrong, and I don't try. So we just, we don't set out to convert. We're truly expressing our views, and no matter how loudly we express them, we're not out there. I never expect to hear Steve say, yeah, you're right, I'm a conservative now. I never expect to hear those words. And if I did, I would be very disappointed.
You're looking at my glass, right?
So, you don't try to convert. If you're trying to convert, you're not listening, you're not weighing ideas, you're not having an intellectual conversation. And the other is, don't get personal. I wish I could call up my email right now at just the subject lines. You idiot. you are so stupid. You turd. I'm like, come on. That's how we communicate, in what's supposed to be, an intellectual discussion. And I'm always willing to call up the emails from the people who disagree with me and weigh their responses and weigh, their views on why my views are wrong, but not if it starts out, you stupid idiot. There's no, you're never going to get past that. You're never going to get your ideas across to someone you want to reach if you start out that way.
I think these are great points. Thanks so much for getting into depth with that. And it sounds like you guys are saying that it's recognizing the shared humanity in the other side, that you have to see that other person for their beliefs, their values,
Absolutely.
their aspirations, and have that respect.
Because what happens if you don't? I mean, we are in a point where we're so convinced that the people we disagree with are evil and want to destroy the country and want to do this and want to do that. And that's both sides. We're so convinced that they are despicable people that we tend to dehumanize them. And we've seen throughout history what happens when you dehumanize groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm afraid if we don't check this, we're lurching in that direction of not thinking of people who hold different views as human beings.
Mm-hmm. So we have other questions I wanted to go to. So Shelley asked, how can we be in conversation with people whose values are so opposite those we hold? And she mentioned, after all, we are the company we keep. And I think this actually opens up an even bigger issue, because when you're on social media, especially, you can choose to only surround yourselves with people who share your opinions and views. And then it's sort of like an echo chamber, and it might make it harder to tolerate or digest other opinions if we're never surrounded by them. So what are your thoughts about Shelley's question?
Well, it's a very comfortable place to live if everybody around you affirms you.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think you grow very much if you're never challenged. And I think you approach conversations with people who hold different values than you do, the same way you approach conversations with those who do. And that's in the spirit of, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to be open to the idea that I might learn something. And I want to understand better what makes you tick, what motivates you. Approach it with that open spirit, that open attitude, that you're another human being, you think different than me, but we can talk.
Yeah. And Shelley writes in the comments, I think she says she's talking about values and not opinions. Mm-hmm. I think that's an important distinction. I do believe that you don't have an obligation to put up with somebody who believes something that that dehumanizes you, that assigns fewer rights to you than everybody else has, or supports the idea that your rights can be oppressed or violently put down. That's not what we're talking about. We have lots of examples in history in this country and around the world where that has needed to be met with force and forceful resistance. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that is an important part, I think, of building a civil society, to say that in order for us to be civil, the first thing that we've got to agree on is that you're no more entitled to the rights that we have than I am, and you are not entitled to put my rights to the side or decide which ones of them deserve respect. I think what we're talking about is the ability in our own communities, with people in spaces where we live, where we're making decisions, to be able to talk to those who really just see it a different way from the way that we do, and maybe don't share every value that we have, but at least have that common respect for humanity and people's rights in common. One of the reasons that, for me at least, it's important to be able to do that with people who you really disagree with is because you want to understand what it is that led them to the opinions that they have. When Nolan says something that I think is just wrong, and that happens a lot, my instinct is to ask him a lot of questions about, well, why do you think that? How did you come to that point of view? I want to know what it is that led him to a place that is so different from the way I see it, in part in hopes of understanding how we might work together on the common parts of what we believe. And this is one of the things that Nolan and I have found over the years, I think, and that really got highlighted in the StoryCorps exercise we did, is that if you dig down deep enough, we both really want the same things. We both really believe in the same outcomes. What divides us is the way that we come to the question and the way that we think those outcomes can be achieved. And if you spend time with people you disagree with, trying to figure out why they believe what they believe, I think you make it possible to get to this idea of commonality, of emphasizing the things that you think you can work kind of together in the same space on, as opposed to only dealing in the space where you disagree. And I think that is at least partly about values, right? You do have to be dealing with somebody who shares some pretty basic values about humanity and about the society that we live in. And there are people who fall outside that purview. I mean, there are just people, who don't believe in those values. And I don't think either of us is saying that you have to countenance that or engage in that. But we are talking about the vast majority of people, I believe, who do believe in those values. They just see it differently in terms of how to lift them up.
And we've never gone to bed angry. We'll fight it out, we'll argue it out, and then before the session, the evening or whatever is over, we're talking about something else, something much lighter, something that we have in common rather than we have in difference. And I think it's important not to walk away from a conversation with somebody you care about with bitterness in your hearts. You can get past that point and walk away still friends. And we've always done that. And also I would add to what Steve was saying, don't make an assumption about other people's values. Find out for yourself, get to know them, listen to them. The first time Steve and I started thinking about this whole issue of talking across the divide, we were in a bar on Mackinac Island for the Republican State Convention. And, I've been walking in, seeing Steve and thinking, man, you are in the lion's den here, man. And so we're standing at the bar and I walk away and these two very, very conservative women who I'd known for a while, they ran a website, whatever. They walked up to me and said, "Oh, how could you be talking to them? He's so awful. He's so evil." And I said, "Do you know him?" And they said, "No." And I said, "Well, why don't you go up there and spend a few minutes with him and see what you think?" And so they did. It was 2 hours later. I'm pulling him away from them. And, they walked to say, "Oh, he's really cool. He's really nice." And I'm like, get to know people before you make a judgment about who they are. Just Sunday school lessons, really.
So we have lots of questions, and I want to make sure everybody gets heard.
Yeah.
So Mike asked you some great questions, and one of the questions he said was, "What is the best way to communicate given these conditions?" And I'd like to add to that question, because as Shelley said, we might be surrounding ourselves with like-minded people. How would we encounter people who have different opinions? if not in the digital space, is it better to be face to face? Should we seek out these opportunities? So what's the best way to communicate toward building civility?
Well, I would say face to face, or, you know, yeah, I think this idea of miscommunication over social media, and it is a very real thing. And it's also very easy when you're detached to be mean, if you will, to be hateful. And when we first started, both of us, when Steve was at the Free Press, when we both started taking comments at the end of stories, I think he had the same notion I did, or at the end of editorials, he had the same notion I did, that, wow, this will really foster a community discussion. This will be good, positive thing. And it turned out it was the most hateful vehicle I have ever seen. People became very vicious, very angry, very mean to each other on the comments. It was different from when they had to sit down at a typewriter and write out a letter to the editor. I mean, the quickness, the ease with which you can communicate oftentimes leads to poor decisions and really hateful comments. So I prefer face to face.
Yeah, but here where we're not we're not really able to
Right.
be face to face with people, and maybe not for some time. I think that adds another layer of challenge to all of this, right? How do you find the opportunity to have an exchange, an actual exchange with somebody, where you can be face to face and learn more about who they are and understand. I'm okay saying I don't know the answer to that. I think this is also new. This is also strange. I mean, think about what we're doing here. Just how odd this is compared to the way that we would normally do it. I think it's going to take some time to find that space where we're able to make progress in the way that you are face to face in a digital world, or an audio world, I suppose, would also be possible. There are forums that are trying, I think, to do that, and there are lots of people, I think, who are really hungry for that. If the calls and the notes to the radio show are any indication, I mean, people are really starved for the ability to do that. But it's going to take us a while, I think, to figure out how all this works and find those opportunities, and then maybe build some of those opportunities ourselves.
I would say that I would just urge everyone to be extra careful at this point in their communications, whether it's on social media or in person, but you're on Facebook, you're on Twitter. Stop and think a little about what you're saying, and whether it's something that needs to be said. It needs to be said right now, and it needs to be said by me. Stop and think. You may be communicating with somebody who's hurting, afraid, worried about their loved ones. That's probably the majority of the people you're communicating with. Have a little sensitivity towards the idea that people may be lashing out of fear, frustration, hurt, and just be a little kinder.
It's a really good point. I think we always have to look beneath the surface of how somebody acts or speaks, because we don't really know the whole story. And maybe that humanity is giving them the benefit of the doubt, and looking a little bit deeper and taking a thought before we actually act. I'm seeing in the chat a lot of conversation about facts and name calling and accusations of fake news, and how do we make sense of all of this and have these civil conversations if we're questioning resources, we're questioning facts. People are resorting to name calling, and that's rampant in our culture right now. So how do we become examples of civility when we're seeing examples like this of incivility?
That's a very good question. I will tell you, last Sunday, I got an email from a woman reader who's started out, that's the most idiotic thing I ever heard. You're a jerk, you're stupid. And, I sent a message back just on impulse. Normally I would ignore something like that. I said, if we could start from a civil point, we might be able to discuss the ideas you raised. And she sent one more, somewhat less hateful email. And I responded back saying, we're still not where we need to be, but let me answer a couple of your questions. And, 4 or 5 exchanges later, we are having a very civil, intellectual conversation expressing why she thought one way, why I thought another. We never come to agreement, but at the end, we thanked each other and both expressed appreciation for our ability to finally get to a civil point and have this exchange of ideas.
So
Yeah,
you basically didn't take the bait there. Like, you wouldn't resort to name calling in return. You would
No, I
say,
mean,
hey,
what's
let's
the
have a
point?
conversation.
Where do
Yeah.
you get with that? This was
Right.
somebody who obviously read the newspaper, was a customer. And so, I wanted to take her down a notch in terms of her tone and see if we could get to the point where we could actually communicate. And, it took a few exchanges, but we got there. And she still walked away disagreeing with me. I'm certain of that, but feeling less hostile toward me and toward the newspaper. And that was my goal.
That idea of not responding in kind to insults, to attacks, that kind of thing, that's really hard to do. I think our human instincts are to defend, right? Defend ourselves. And there's that sort of instant angry response that you have, that somebody sent you something or said something to you that's insulting. That is one of the harder parts of this, I think, because that first response, that first in-kind response, ratchets up. It makes it seem like it's okay, and that's the context in which you want to interact. And so then the other party is just off and running. One of the other principles that we talk about with civility is that if it's easy, feels easy, you're probably not doing it right. This is not easy. This is hard. It is hard to swallow those sort of instincts that say, I've got to show this person, I've got to prove the person wrong, I got to win, in order to say, well, maybe there's a different kind of goal here. Instead of showing this person or winning, maybe I can actually start a dialogue with someone who I wouldn't otherwise have to do that with. Now, that doesn't always work. I'll be the first one to say that sometimes what you get back is just more of the same. And sometimes you got to move on. You have to say, again, that's a values question, right? That's not somebody who wants to be in this space. But even somebody who does, again, it's difficult to manage that. It's difficult to work that out and get to some place where.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not pretending this is easy or that it is our first nature. I know it's not for me. My instinct is to tug, not hug. And it's sometimes, I've got a temper and I flare up. And it's sometimes very hard for me not to let that take over. And we're not 100%. I'm not 100%. And there's some people you just don't like. And there's some people you're just not going to be able to be civil with. And you make the decision, I'm going to social distance from that person. This is good practice. I've been telling everybody, I hope when this thing is over, people still stay 6 feet away from me. I sort of like the space, but you're not going to be able to do this with everybody. But if it can become your goal, your more common practice, some people are still going to push your buttons.
I can't do nothing.
And, there's people I could just think of and my blood boils. So, we're not saints, particularly
So
Steve.
there's a great conversation in the chat about and I think this applies now, I think it applies to our political leanings as well, but when people are perceived as having stances and taking actions that you believe harm people, how can you try to build civility with them? And so this could apply in the current situation with people saying, you know, don't do this treatment or do this treatment, or again, we don't know any answers when it comes to how to treat the coronavirus, but people are trying. And I think that plays out when they're looking at the abortion conversation and at other conversations. So I'm just wondering how we can approach civility with people we perceive as holding beliefs and taking actions that bring others harm.
Well, I mean, actions are one thing. I think beliefs are another. And again, I would go back to your perceptions. Not everybody who thinks differently than you, wants to hurt, or wants to destroy. I mean, there are almost every issue. There are very good reasons people are on one side or the other. And I would say there's very few cases, outside of racism, sexism, whatever, very few cases where there's not some legitimate room for disagreement. And I think we need to understand that. And you never want to drive dissent underground, because that's where it festers and becomes something dangerous. We want to keep as many ideas open and in the public square, and even the most offensive ones, we want to keep them there where they can be debated and discredited. You drive things underground, you don't know what's going on.
One of the problems that we have, and this is not, I don't have a solution to this, I'll say up front. One of the problems we have right now is the behavior of the person who's in the Oval Office, who has the most tremendous platform for influencing American thought and behavior of anyone, and who has spent every minute of his time on that platform blurring lines between appropriate and inappropriate behavior. And I'll go back to what happened in Charlottesville very early in this presidency, where you had neo-Nazis with torches marching, and you had protesters there to meet them. Now, that's a dangerous situation. There was no question that the police there handled it poorly and in a way that had people too close together, didn't control the behavior of some of the folks. But then, as the leader of the free world, to come out and say, there were good people on both sides of that issue there, where there isn't a whole lot of, there's not a whole lot of question about that. If you're at a neo-Nazi rally, sorry, there isn't a question about what you think. If you're at a neo-Nazi rally, sorry, you don't escape the taint of that point of view, which is violence and dehumanization. And to have the president blurring that distinction, which he's been very good at sort of saying and doing things and pretending as though they aren't outrageous. That has lowered a bar that was already moving down quite a bit in 3 years. And that makes it harder to deal with the things that really are outrageous. And I'm the first one to say that, people who believe, in extreme ideologies are not the same as people who act on violence, or are not the same as people who go out and march in Klan rallies. I mean, it's okay to believe in extreme left or extreme right politics. What he's done is blurred that with these other things. And that's, I mean, it's dangerous, and it's the kind of thing that will last long after he's president. I mean, we will have so much work to do sewing back together civil society after he's gone, not because he tore it in the first place, but because he saw rips in it and went after them and widened them in really irresponsible ways.
But I would say this, and I hear too many people blaming their own incivility and their own inappropriate behavior on the president. He's responsible for his own behavior. It's our choice whether to take that lead and say, well, I hear so many people saying, well, what about Trump? Trump does it. Trump says it. You don't have to follow anybody's bad example. And, you know, I feel too many people are using Trump's behavior on both sides, either following his lead or trying to match his vitriol, using that as an excuse for us to act poorly. We know who we are, and we don't have to act the same way someone else acts. I just don't, I really don't accept that trying to exonerate ourselves from our own incivility because of anything Donald Trump says or does.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's appropriate responses, but to behave in the same manner is not an appropriate response.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's no question that it's not a cover for the things that some people have chosen to do. I guess what I'm talking about is the onus that falls on the person who has that role. And it is really different than what any of the rest of us own. It just is. And if you contrast the way that he has used that incredible power with almost any other person who has had that role, I mean, there's just no excuse. There's no
I'm not arguing with you, Steve, but I am saying that too many people have said, have gotten down in the mud with him when we could have stayed up, and it would have been more powerful had the rest of us on both sides acted the way we know we ought to be acting, rather than getting down and wallowing. I just think that's true. Lynn, do we have other questions?
We do. So we have just.
Hold on a second.
Oh, go ahead, Stephen. Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is, regardless of how people respond to him, the level of responsibility is not the same. It doesn't come close.
No, I'm not saying it is, but I am saying this, that we've allowed him to change us, and you don't have to allow anybody to change you.
No, but the president.
We know better than this.
So we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and there's tons of conversation, which is awesome. And I don't know that I'll get to everybody, so thank you for everyone who's chiming in. But one thing that I'd love to ask, based on what you guys were just talking about, and then that brings up another question we had in the chat, is the question is, either Trump has brought this out, or he simply made us aware of what was already simmering. And in the second part to that is, where did this hostility come from? Do we have a sense? It's a very big question, but do we have a sense of where this hostility came from and how we got to this point? I mean, personally, I feel that Trump simply brought it out. It was there. It wasn't his doing. But how did we get here? How did we get so divided?
I mean, this didn't just start 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I mean, we saw going back to the Clinton years, or even to the Reagan years, this sort of divide starting to build in America. And it became greater and greater with each administration. I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, horrible things were said about Obama, horrible things were said about Bush, and the country divided itself up, I think, years ago, and it's just become, the gap has become greater. I think social media has played a big role in it, the changing of our communication means. I mean, cable television has changed us in ways. It's become too easy to bunker up and associate only with the people on your side and not have much interaction with the people on the other side. I think there's a lot of things that have gone into it but it's been building for years. And I just wonder where it goes next.
You
Because I
know,
don't think this ends with Donald Trump.
so it's also true that this is a country, at least, that has gone through periods like this
That's right.
in several different instances. And one of the things I'm really quick to caution people against is saying, well, this is the worst it's ever been. It's not. The worst it ever was when we fought a war against each other to end the scourge of slavery, and cost untold lives and untold damage. But that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that we have gotten to a worse point than this in the past.
And got over it.
What's that?
And got over it. I mean, some of
yeah,
you,
we did. We had to fight a war to get over it, but
well, and that wasn't the only time. I mean, I was a teenager during the anti-war movement and the Civil War or civil rights movement in the 60s, and saw Americans were shot by our government on the streets, on campuses. I mean, it's gotten worse than this.
Yeah.
But every couple generations, we have to be reminded of it.
But the other historical example that I like to bring up is that in almost every era where it has gotten to this point, what comes next is tremendous progress.
I hope so.
And part of it is because these kinds of tensions are inspired by fundamental change to begin with, right? In this case, I believe a lot of it is the ethnic and demographic changes that we're experiencing. I mean, this country has changed in that way in the last 20 years, 25 years, in ways that it never had before. And that is an automatic stressor. It's a stressor for the majority population. It's also a stressor for emerging minority populations. And I think what we are seeing, unfortunately, is too many people in positions of leadership who want to exploit those tensions rather than help people understand them and see what's possible. And of course, the president is a terrible example of that as well. His entire presidency is based on exploiting that fear. But again, just like in the civil rights movement, where the impetus for change really was the end of tolerance for two societies, one black and unequal, one white and privileged. At the end of all of that, we got to a better place. Now, was it a perfect place? No, but it was a place of progress, and it was a place that's my mother calling. So,
well, I would say, I know we're near the end here, is that the one thing we can say about America and Americans is that we never stop striving to be better. We never stop striving for perfection. And we will, I think that's to our character. We've always, sometimes it's taken us a long time to get around to recognizing wrong, but there's always people who are trying to make it right, and those numbers grow over time. We have fixed a lot of things that are wrong in this country over our history, have a lot more to fix, but we're always striving. Before we go, Lynn, I want to tell people, this was our first time doing this. It's been fun. I think Steve would agree that we've enjoyed it. We would like, until that time when we can get out, we would like to do more of these sessions in this format. If you have groups, churches, other communities, your neighbors, whatever, we'll do this as often as somebody wants to do it. We'd love to do this. And this is, I'm pleased with the format, and I hope you all are.
So I just want to mention a quick little comment that Megan put in the chat, because I think it's a wonderful way to end on a note of optimism. But she was saying that in this current coronavirus crisis, she finds success talking with people she disagrees with by starting with the proposition that the conservative perspective is an optimistic one, that the health crisis is not as serious as maybe the more progressive leaders might believe. And I think giving that benefit of the doubt is a real show of strength, and something that maybe we all can take with us when we go back into the social sphere and hear what everybody has to say, and maybe give them a shred of benefit of the doubt.
Well, thanks to all you. Thanks, Lynn. Margaret, thanks to Delta Dental Plans of Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana for sponsoring this session, and others within the Civility Project. And again, let Lynn know if you have a group that you would like to do one of these sessions. We're happy to join.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Nolan. Thanks everybody for being here and for the great commentary in the chat too. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.